Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, the author of Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, Gravity Railroad, Volumes 1 through 5, S. Robert Powell.
Robert Powell, author of the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, Gravity Railroad. You say at the start of your book that the Industrial Revolution was born in 1829 in Carbondale, Pennsylvania. How can you pinpoint it that specifically?
Well, it's a symbolic date, more or less, really. One has to, it's like, for example, when did the American Revolution start? Was it at Bunker Hill? I mean, one sort of has to sort of arrive at a date. I mean, it was going on, things were going on in the background for years, and you need a crystallizing event which you can sort of identify. So I chose that date as an identifying beginning point, although one could argue it backward and forward a bit with other events probably. But the thing which motivated me primarily with that date in Carbondale was the fact that the coal that was going out of Carbondale beginning on that October day in 1829 provided the fuel for thousands of people all over the eastern seaboard to take the next step in the movement from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. So without that coal, it couldn't have happened. And so in a way, it was like a catalyst. It really was an interesting point. One could, somebody put a gun to my head and say, why October 9? Well, one could argue that there are other dates might be nearby, but the argument, the convincing thing for me was that it provided the fuel that made it all happen everywhere.
What was it that happened on that date?
On that date, this railroad became operational. It was created literally from nothing when these engineers determined to get this coal to market. There were no existing systems of transportation in America at the time that could have done it. The railroad that began in Carbondale was the third railroad of any kind in America at the time. There was one, a rudimentary railroad at Breeds Hill in Boston when they were building the Bunker Hill Monument. They needed a tram road to get the granite down to the water level to get it to Breeds Hill to make the Bunker Hill Monument. That was a 3 mile long essentially tram road where the cars sort of coasted down an inclined plane. There was not really any machinery involved. They just sort of coasted down a plane. And then there was one in Pennsylvania again at Jim Thorpe in 1827, where that was again a system of one inclined plane down which the cars rolled. The thing which is so remarkable about what happened in Carbondale is that it was a complete system operating from Carbondale to the Hudson River, 125 miles away, with an amazingly complex series of inclined planes and stationary engines and levels and all manner of technical machinery to make it happen. And it was done in conjunction with a 108-mile long canal, both of which were created out of nothing. I mean, at the time when they were doing this, northeastern Pennsylvania was essentially a wilderness. There was nothing there, and so they had to get all their materials and technology together and for that one day. And the astonishing thing from my perspective is that they were creating the technology as they went along. They were not using existing technology. They were creating a technological revolution in doing what they did. And it's so astonishing that they could make all this happen from nothing. The rails had to be imported from Great Britain. The engines had to be gotten, from a company on the Hudson River, and brought there, and then installed, and then all of a sudden they were operational. But it was a very complex system of planes and levels. The coal cars were brought in on a level piece of land, and the front of the coal car was then attached to a cable, and they were pulled up an inclined plane, sort of like an old-fashioned roller coaster.
So the engine was stationary?
The engine was stationary. At the top of the inclined plane was a stationary which pulled the coal cars up to the engines. At the top of the inclined plane, the cars were disconnected and they sort of coasted down a little bit a level, and then they did it again, up again, and up again, and up again. And in the process of getting the coal out of the Lackawanna Valley, they carried these cars 1,000 feet in the air in a very short period of space, a distance of space up this very steep Moosic mountain outside of Carbondale. And so when they got them to the top of the mountain, this is where the gravity business of this gravity railroad kicks in, because they had to work like crazy to get the coal to the top of the mountain. But once it was there, the coal cars were let down in steps again to the bottom of the mountain on the other side. And then they coasted miles into Honesdale, all this going downhill. And at Honesdale, the coal cars were emptied into a canal, a 108-mile-long canal. So the coal started out in the Lackawanna Valley at about 1,000 feet above sea level, then took it up 1,000 feet in the air. Then they lowered it down about 1,000 feet into Honesdale. And at Honesdale, you're still 1,000 feet above sea level. So the canal then, all this coal was loaded into these canal boats, and the canal boats function the same way that this gravity railroad functioned because of gravity. The canal boat is brought in, the water is let out of the lock, the canal boat goes down and goes down and goes down. And they did this for 108 miles long. It was an extraordinarily long canal. I mean, for example, the Suez Canal is about 100 miles long. The Panama Canal is about 50 miles long. But the D&H Canal was 108 miles long. And
well, I want to back up to the cars. So these railroad cars, they would load at the top of the hill and just roll? They had no power of their own?
They were lower. They had to be attached to cables to lower them down, but they didn't require energy but they had to be held back so that because they were just too much weight, they would go out of control to get to the bottom of it.
So they were attached to a cable the whole time they were going down?
They were going down, yes. And again, even on the downhill planes, it was lowered and the car coasted a little bit, then it was connected again and lowered again. So they were always under control, but even on these levels, I mean, the control. There were people who rode these coal cars with brakes, but they were like friction brakes, so that they were quickly turning wheels to slow these things down, and to get this coal to Honesdale and then to the Hudson River. And that was only part of the game. When they got up to the Hudson River at Kingston, they were then still a long way from New York, so they then had to take the coal boats, the canal boats, were unloaded then into Hudson River sloops and then taken all the way down the Hudson River to New York, and then unloaded at wholesalers in New York and then ultimately to the customers. And the thing which is so astonishing about this D&H system is that the coal not only went from Carbondale to New York, but at New York, some of these coal boats then went out into the Atlantic and went both ways. So the Lackawanna Valley coal was going as far north as Boston and Providence, and then it was going down the eastern seaboard as far as New Orleans with this coal. And at Kingston, New York, the coal boats were sent up the Hudson River to Albany and then transshipped through the Erie Canal into the American Midwest. So the Lackawanna Valley coal was everywhere, and it affected lives all over the Eastern America. So that really, that kind of that broad market area is what interests me a lot with this industrialization of America.
Well, before we get much farther, I have to ask you about this because we have gotten this. This book is on 5 CDs, so this is nothing like anything we've had on this program before. Can you explain just what this is?
Each of those DVDs is one manifestation of the railroad, and each of the DVDs is essentially a book, like a 600 or 700 page gigantic PDF file. And so one inserts the disc in a computer, and then you sort of scroll through it. So it's not like one sort of sits back and watches a DVD roll by in front of you. You sort of have to work at it a bit. I mean, it's a very sort of academic kind of thing. But in a way, my whole background has been involved with academia, and so it's a format which appeals to me a lot, and so they're very the medium is such an appealing medium from my point of view because it's infinitely expandable and easily expandable and revisable and correctable and all those wonderful things, and yet it's very compact and the product is so wonderful on a computer screen because the sky's the limit. How big is your screen? How big can these pictures be? And it's loaded with pictures and maps and drawings and things, so that it's very, I think, user friendly, and I like the fact that it's so compact and yet infinitely expandable.
Now this is 5 volumes covering 5 different eras, but this is 5 volumes of a planned 24 volume?
That's correct,
series.
Yes.
And the 5 volumes already is 2,000 pages.
That's right, yeah.
And it's all you working on it?
Yes, it is. I have a couple of colleagues in the Carbondale Historical Society are very interested in the project as well, but we sort of work together and make it. But I'm the one who sort of has this obsession with getting it into print, kind of thing, So it's a. But the 24 volume aspect of it is it's such a broad topic. But the first 5 volumes, which all appeared on October 9th of last year, all had to come out essentially at the same time because for example, on the 1845 volume, as I was working on that, I may have learned something which then modified my thinking about what happened in 1829. And when I was working on 68, so the ramifications backwards and forwards, so that so having gotten them all sort of out of here and onto that, I then spent months arguing against myself, trying to prove myself wrong, and then I think I have it. I think I have it now, and I then decided then I would publish them on October 9, which was the day that the Gravity Railroad itself became operational in 1829. So it was everyone who knows me knows that what is Robert doing at the Historical Society? 15 hours a day. Well, he's working on this stuff, and.
How long did you work on it before you had it in the form that you could publish?
At least 10 years. I was working. Those first volumes took 10 years, only because it is such a vast project, and no one has ever really systematically approached it from a comprehensive point of view, because it's very detailed and very complicated, because they essentially rebuilt the railroad 5 times in the course of the 19th century, 1829, and then they did it again in 45 and 59, 68, and 99. So it was not a question of, it wasn't just like one footprint. The railroad in 29 may have gone over the mountain this way, 45 went this way, 68 went another way. And all of the different configurations of the railroad were a consequence of the openness of the market. Every time they revised the railroad, people were saying, we need more, send us more coal. It was an open-ended market. And so in 45, they made a whole series of modifications to get more coal into the system.
Was it all gravity in all the directions when they expanded?
They were, yes. And for example, in 29, when it opened, there were 5 planes on the Carbondale side of the mountain. And in 68, there were 8.
What constitutes a plane?
A plane is one of these incline from the bottom where the cars connect onto it to the top where they're disconnected. And then they coast, and then they go up another plane. So there were 28 planes ultimately, but it started out with just 8 planes, and they determined that the more planes you have operating, the more coal you could get into the system. If you have just one very long plane, you've got to wait for those cars to get out of that plane before you can put in more. But if you have lots of smaller planes, you can get more into the system. And the thing which is really quite interesting from a marketing perspective and from a labor relations perspective is the fact that all these efforts to get more coal into the system were very effective. They were very good at doing what they did. And so 45, yes, send us more. 59, we need more, we need more, we need more. And then in the 1860s, the late 1860s, a very interesting thing happened. They satiated the market more or less. everybody seemed to be happy. But then that opened the door. What a door that opened, because when suddenly you have all these many thousands of workers who are getting a product to market, and the market's needs are taken care of, you have to cut back on production. So if you cut back on production, you're negatively impacting all the workers who are producing all that coal. So that in the 1860s is when labor and management began to go at it, because management said we've got to cut back production, and then they had to lay off laborers, or they had to reduce wages and so on. And so from the mid 60s until 1902, it was just back and forth labor problems, strikes of all kinds, and it's easy to understand both points of view. I mean, the management was out there to make money. They weren't doing this as a hobby, so they had to control the amount of coal they were sending to market, and the workers, the laborers, all of course wanted to get as much as possible because you get more money.
Did Delaware and Hudson own the coal mines also?
They owned many of them, but they didn't own them all. Other people got into the game very quickly. The interesting thing about the D&H had a running start because the fellows who started the company, Morris and William Wirtz, in the 1820s, were clothing merchants in Philadelphia, manufacturers, and they provided uniforms for the federal government for the War of 1812, and in partial payment for their uniforms, the government gave them 7,000 acres of land in northeastern Pennsylvania. Sort of like, here, take this. You know, I think they thought they were giving away sort of scrub land. And remarkably, they gave away the largest deposit of anthracite coal in North America. 484 square miles of anthracite coal, worth millions, trillions of dollars, just unbelievable quantity of coal. And, but then, as I say, in the 60s, they then had to start controlling the market. And then the labor management thing got going big time.
I want to ask you, you say in the book that in 1848, the Delaware and Hudson was the largest private corporation in the United States. Do people know? Is that a surprise to people when they hear that?
Yes, I think it is. The remarkable thing was that on January 7, 1825, the D&H had a public offering of their stock at a coffee house in New York, the Tontine Coffee House on Wall Street. They also they opened their subscription books in Goshen, New York, and in Kingston, New York. In one day, in January of 1825, they sold $1.5 million worth of stock, which is really just astonishing. And when you think of the multiple, whatever it must be for what a dollar then would be worth now, kind of stuff, So when you think of the vast quantity of money involved with it, but what they were doing, they were so profitable because America was in the throes of its first energy crisis, because the trees essentially had all been cut down. All the eastern cities, they weren't large cities that we know today, but they were still, 50, 75,000 people heating their buildings by lumber, wood, or maybe charcoal. And all you have to do is realize if there's a wood burner in your world, you happen to know how quickly a wood pile can disappear. When you multiply that by 50,000 people, all the trees within an immediate area of a community are gone. So Philadelphia and New York especially were literally without a fuel, and so it was unbelievable market conditions because this Delaware and Hudson Canal Company provided these people with the fuel, and they were their marketing. They were such intelligent marketers. They heated this Tontine Coffee House in New York where they were offering making a public offering with anthracite coal. So potential buyers came into this wonderfully warm environment heated by anthracite coal, and they didn't know how to burn it. They didn't know how to use it. But then the D&H sort of said, "Well, here's how you do it," and then we're selling stock at the same time. So all the variables were wonderful for their marketing purposes.
How did the canals fit into it?
The canal, that was the great era of American canals in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and but the canals were an easy way to get the coal to market. You could take vast quantities of coal in canal boats and get them to get them to market. On the D&H Canal, they had, which was 108 miles long with 108 locks, they had, this is another remarkable thing about the D&H, they had the brightest and best people involved from the very beginning. They had, for example, building the railroad, they had Benjamin Wright and John Jarvis and James Archibald, who had just finished the Erie Canal in 1825. And then in 1826, that whole production team was essentially brought to northeastern Pennsylvania by the D&H, and they began building the D&H Gravity Railroad and the D&H Canal.
So was the Gravity Railroad was supposed to take the coal to the canal?
That's
and
correct.
Then the canal got, and where did the canal run?
The canal went from Honesdale, Pennsylvania, to all the way east to 108 miles to Kingston on the Hudson River. And in so doing, it was, the canal people would call it was an inland riparian canal. It followed four rivers to get there. It followed the Lackawaxen and the Delaware, and the Lackawaxen and the Delaware, the Neversink, and the Rondout Creek to get to the Hudson River, and to get across. The remarkable thing is that this canal crossed over these rivers. And for example, at Lackawaxen on the Delaware, it's still standing, and it's a magnificent engineering achievement is the Lackawaxen Canal. And the person who built these was John Roebling, and the Roebling family then, after that, built the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, so they had the most remarkable people involved in the construction of their transportation system.
So it's actually a trough full of water that goes over top of a river, and the boats would go over top of the river.
And you can go to Lackawaxen today, and you still see this remarkable thing across the Delaware River, and the canal was almost 40 feet wide. This gigantic sort of trough going across the top over the Delaware River on a wire suspension bridge, built in the 1840s by John Roebling, and it's still there and still just as strong as it was when they finished it. And there were four of these aqueducts that were along this canal to the Hudson River, and the Roebling connection is it's typical of the D&H. As I said, they always got the brightest and the best involved, and all these I can't say enough for Benjamin Wright and John Jarvis and James Archibald with the Erie Canal. The D&H as managers, they were magnificent. They knew what they wanted to do, and they knew they had to get the brightest and best people involved to make it happen. Who are we going to get to do this? So they knew enough to get that production team from the Erie Canal, get them here, get them on our team. When they began mining, they knew they had this astonishing resource, but they needed to learn how to do deep underground anthracite mining. If you and I were to go out there and start mining coal, we might just sort of dig a pit and fall in. I mean, we wouldn't do it. You know, there's things you got to do. I know I would, maybe you wouldn't, but so at that point they recruited from Wales 90 Welsh families to come to Carbondale and show them how to do deep underground shaft mining. So you put this a vertical shaft down, and then tunnels off of it. There's a lot of technology involved to make sure the whole thing doesn't collapse on you, but the idea of recruiting not just 90 men, 90 families to come to Carbondale and to show them how to do this. They recruited from Scotland, getting very celebrated Scottish shaft sinkers, as they were called, to do these vertical shafts down and get to the best coal. But they did that throughout the 19th century and get the best people involved, and they really were astonishing managers. One of the greatest is a big hero of mine. His name is Thomas Dixon, who ultimately became president of the company after the Civil War. And he was president at the time when all these labor problems started going on. But yet he was such an astonishingly good manager with such good people skills that he would make very tough decisions, and the workers would say, "Mr. Dixon, we need more money." He would say, "Well, I gave you everything I had if I could, but I can't." Back and forth, and they respected him terrifically. Well, he was highly regarded by them always, and he moved heaven and earth because he was honest, straightforward, and was a very good manager. Other managers along the way didn't have such good people skills, and they were hated by the people who were working for them. And but all throughout the century, the good outweighed the bad, certainly, and they became extraordinarily profitable very quickly because of their skills in management and getting the right people involved to help them be successful.
You mentioned some people, John Jarvis and somebody named Archibald and somebody named
Benjamin Wright.
Oliphant, who have towns named after them.
That's right.
Up
yes.
there. Did the company own the towns that they named the towns after their own people?
Well, it was a question of sort of spreading out. For example, in Carbondale, there's a very old cemetery called Maplewood Cemetery, which the first burials were in the 1830s. And remarkably, some of there are maybe 6 or 8 stones in that cemetery in Welsh, with Welsh inscriptions. But also in that cemetery, there are plots, family plots of Archibald, Dixon, Peck, Justice, Troop, Oliphant. All these families were involved with the company originally, and then they sort of started moving out, and so the Oliphants moved down the Lackawanna Valley, and then the community was called Oliphant. Archibald was named after James Archibald, and so they were all when we do bus tours in the area and point this out to people, and they can't believe that they're looking at Peck, Dixon, Oliphant, Troop, Justice, Blakely. All these people are there. They're human beings. There's a reason. There's a name. The reason for the name of the community is there. And and they came from all over the world. I mean, the original people were Scottish and Welsh. Well, the Wirtz brothers were Swiss, and then you can follow all of the 19th century immigration patterns into the anthracite fields. I mean, the Scottish and the Welsh, followed by the English and the Germans, and then with all the famine problems in Ireland, all the enormous Irish immigrations into northeastern Pennsylvania in the 1840s and 50s, and then after the Civil War, all the Central and Northern Europeans, from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Russia, Ukraine, all these countries. So that there were like 25 or 26 different countries where these people came from to start their lives over again in the anthracite fields.
You mentioned the name Wirtz, W-U-R-T-S, and there's a lot of Wirtz sprinkled throughout your story. And one of them became a congressman who you said helped pass favorable legislation toward the company.
Yes, I guess it's good to have friends in high places. The brother of these two guys, William and Morris Wirtz, was John Wirtz, who was also in the Pennsylvania legislature. So that it was. I'm not suggesting or saying that anything was crooked or under the table, but you can enhance your move by getting the right person to support your legislation, and they really didn't do anything illegal, but it was simply a question of targeting the legislation to take care of their needs, and by having somebody in the legislature would be that would help the process along, So,
getting back to the canals, can you talk about if you were standing on the side of the canal, what would you see? And they had 108 locks.
Yes.
And so they had to have one person at each lock. Did they live there, or how did that work?
They did. Yes. In fact, they lived at their workstation. So there was a lock tender at each lock who had a house there, and so when the boats came to that lock, he and his family or employees then got the boat through the lock and sent it on to the next. And the same thing happened with the railroad. Through all these inclined planes, they essentially became communities unto themselves. For example, people would identify themselves as being from number 4. What does number 4 means? Number 4 plane. But it was really an autonomous community because they had a school there, they had churches there, they lived at their workstation, and they may not have. I've read obituaries where someone might say that they spent their whole life at number 5 and never once were into Carbondale, which was like 5 miles away. They didn't move from where they were.
Did businesses or hotels or something spring up along the canal? Did people, did you ride for a while and then stop and stay overnight and ride, or did you go?
You could. One could sleep on these passenger boats on the canal too.
They had passenger boats.
But yes, they did. But 99% of them were coal boats. But then larger communities along the way, like Port Jervis, that was a big. The canal went through a big town. Honesdale was a big town where they went through, and so there all the amenities of a large urban area were available. But for the most part, it was just one lock after another through wilderness until you got to the Hudson River.
How did they propel the boats?
They pulled them they were pulled by horses and mules, mostly by mules, and the members of the family would operate the whole lock. I mean, the father might operate the mechanisms to get the boats, the highly technical stuff to getting the boat through the canal. But then the children were the children of the lock people frequently were the ones who were sort of accompanied the mules, walked with the mules to keep them, to make sure they didn't get into the canal, or they didn't get where they shouldn't be. But lots of boys, young people, walked leading these horses and mules from Honesdale to the Hudson River.
And if you were at a lock, how many boats would pass in a day?
Oh, it was hundreds. Could be many hundreds, because it was a two-way street. They were coming. The empty boats were coming back, and the loaded boats were on the way to the Hudson River. And the canal was roughly 40 feet wide, so there was enough room for the two boats to pass. And periodically there were these large basins where one could sort of spend overnight to sort of stop the whole process and just sort of wait and not do it until tomorrow, the movement through the canal, so that it was a just constant back and forth. With these coal cars, by the time of the Civil War, they were sending 2,000 coal cars a day out of Carbondale over this mountain at that angle. They would get 4 or 5 cars through one plane, and the next thing you know, 4 or 5 more would be coming along. And so shortly after the Civil War, they were shipping 1 million tons of coal a year. And the numbers they just astonish me every time I learn more numbers about the quantity of coal. And but from a American labor technology point of view, an extraordinary thing about this transportation system is that, for example, a miner would be deep underground mining the coal, putting it into a coal car, and sending it from here to there. At which point it was handed off from somebody else who got it out of the mine to get it onto a track, to get it to the base of get it to a breaker where it was cleaned and purified and so on. And then from there, somebody handed it back off to somebody else, to someone else, to someone else. Finally, it got to the railroad, and there were people whose job it was at the bottom of plane, footmen they were called, at the bottom of plane number 1 to get these cars going up the plane. There was another crew at the top of the plane who took care of the cars there. Then there were people on the distance between the planes. There were these levels, and there were people who worked only on the levels. So and the same thing happened for 125 miles. The product was brought to you. You were essentially you were stationary, as it turns out. I mean, you lived where you worked. And the thing which I think is really very interesting is the fact that it was like a 125-mile conveyor belt between Carbondale and the Hudson River, because the workers were stationary and the product came to you, which is it's really an amazing innovation in production. It's Henry Ford in his production line, because the product comes to the worker. You can get more done if the product comes to if the worker has to go look for his next job, you're not being as efficient as you could be. Bring the product to the worker, and then do what you have to do, and then pass it on.
You mentioned that they had some passenger canal boats. Did they have passengers on the Gravity Railroad?
They did. They initiated passenger service in the 60s and 70s, and the thing which was so remarkable about the passenger service is that it was an amazing source of revenue. They built on the top of this mountain above Carbondale a 600-acre sort of picnic park, and it was nothing but sort of picnic areas, a dance pavilion, observatories, and that was it. But people by the thousands from all over northeastern Pennsylvania came there on Saturdays. As many as 15,000 people a day were taken to the top of this mountain on these extraordinary open-air excursion cars, which were literally open. They were like benches on flat cars with a roof, and the thrill of it all was to ride the gravity railroad because there was no visible engine. You were just sort of moving along quietly.
So there's no smoke from the
no smoke or cinders or anything of that sort. And one of the portions of the rail line was called Shepherd's Crook, and in order to get from the top of the mountain where this park was to the valley floor, they put the track so it followed the ridge lines essentially, so that the railroad went off this way and then sort of gradually came around a bend and it went back this way and then it sort of swung down and got to the valley floor. So you couldn't send a car, just sort of send it down like this, but you could bring it down gradually. At this celebrated Shepherd's Crook on the light track, as they call it, the empty cars, they call it the light track. As the cars were sort of coming down this way, sometimes these passenger vehicles there were so many cars on the track, you could see that you were on the car here, and you could see the front of the car down below you, and it was like this gigantic snake coming down the mountain.
How fast did it go?
25 miles an hour. And the thing of it is, at one point you could coast for 14 miles, just on this open air car through this gorgeous countryside. And on that 14-mile line, they then extended the railroad down the Lackawanna Valley. That's when they extended it to Archbold in 1845. They extended it to Oliphant in 1859, then Scranton in 1860. So all this movement of cars made possible by forces of nature.
You mentioned an actual locomotive. They tried the Stourbridge Lion.
Correct.
And I remember reading about that as a kid. That was a famous train, right?
It was. It was the first first steam engine operational in America. It was brought. It was brought to serve the purpose of pulling the cars on these. In the original configuration of the line, there were 3 sections where there was a long stretch where these cars had. They thought they would pull them with these steam engines, the first steam engines in existence. And the Stourbridge Line and two other engines, the Delaware and the Hudson, were brought here to pull the cars on the long level. Regrettably, the rails were not strong enough to sort of support the engine because the rails were made out of wood, hemlock logs, the little narrow facing of metal on the top of it, and they didn't have the technology that we now have to get the rails as rigid as they'd have to be. So they experimentally ran this Stourbridge Lion on rails in Honesdale, and it was not successful. The rails were not up to, they couldn't handle the weight of the engines, and so then they decided that they couldn't use them, and they took them off the tracks, and that was it. So they then started moving the cars on these long levels by horses, and they felt that to be that was a much better way of doing it than with these large engines, which were too large for the system. But the Stourbridge Lion, most of it is now in the Smithsonian, and one can go there and have a look at it. And it was a remarkable engine, but it was not. It was too much weight for the transportation system that they then had.
Did they eventually start using railroads just as regular railroads?
They did, yes. By the 1870s, steam locomotives were becoming more prevalent in America, and then they followed the valleys, and they instead of trying to go over mountains, they went the sort of the long way and got to their markets. So in the 1870s, the first steam engines in the conventional railroad started to appear big time in America. But the gravity system, which was so interesting, it was an existing, successful transportation system. And so they continued to use it until the end of the 19th century because it was an in-place, successful operating system. And the steam locomotive system was just sort of getting itself going. So it would be unwise, I would think, and I think they thought the same. You just don't sort of cancel what you have. I mean, it's working. Let's keep using it as long as we can. And the thing which was remarkable is this park, this Farview Park on top of the mountain, was an amazing source of revenue. 15,000 people were spending 50 cents a piece to get up there. So that's like $7,500 on one day, which is a lot of money in 1868. So it was very profitable, and people came from as far away as New York, Boston, Philadelphia to ride on this celebrated railroad, because it was such a novel experience, and people came from far and near. It was booked solid every year, as soon as from April until November, with people coming from far and near to go to the top of the mountain. Fresh air, sunshine, away from the dirty, grimy industrial valleys below, and it was a huge success, and that, I think, probably kept the system operating as a coal transportation system a little longer than it ordinarily might have. But since they were taking passengers, they might as well continue to ship coal. And because, as you say, by the 60s and 70s, steam locomotives were becoming quite a reality, and you can send a lot more coal being pulled by a conventional steam locomotive than through this by that point, archaic transportation system.
Did I read your book correctly that the standard gauge for railroads is what it is because of the Romans?
Yes, it is. When they were creating this gauge for the gravity railroad, the width between the wheels, the people who were creating these American engines and American cars were connected pretty well to the same people. They had colleagues in Great Britain, where the British had a little bit of a head start on us in this. And so Stevenson was his name in Great Britain, was asked, why have you made the gauge of these cars 51 inches, 4 feet 3? And he said, I don't know, but that's the width of the wheels on the colliery wagons in the Newcastle district of Great Britain, in the coal mining, where they've been mining coal for hundreds of years. So that 51 inches was the standard width between the wheels, and they really weren't sure why it was 51. And then remarkable things happened. Later on, during some excavations on Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, which went from coast to coast in England to sort of the barbarians were above it, and then the Romans were below it. So that but this wall across England, and during excavations, they discovered that some of these Roman roads that were used in constructing Hadrian's Wall, these wagons had left ruts in the stones and in the wheel and the earth there, and they measured the distance on those. And what do you think? 51 inches, 4 feet 3 inches. 51 inches was the width of the wheels on these Roman work vehicles. And then you keep backing the thing up, it becomes more interesting. They backed it up then to the Roman army with their chariots and the Roman Empire. The chariot wheels, the sort of Ben-Hur type chariots, 51 inches. So that the Romans, during the occupation of Great Britain, when building Hadrian's Wall, they adopted the same 51 inches, which happens to be the Roman. They call it a double stride, left, right, left, which is 51 inches. That 51 inches, you multiply that by 1,000, and you get a Roman mile. So all of these numbers are so loaded. They go right back to ancient Rome, and they even go back to Pompeii and Herculaneum, excavations there, 51 inches, and it's because of these Roman chariots. And so that you had to, if you made them wider, these carts and so on wouldn't have fitted in the existing roads. So don't mess with success. Make them 51 inches, and so it's astonishing that literally from Pompeii and Herculaneum we get 51-inch gravity railroad cars going out of Carbondale.
What did the canals do in the winter?
The canal closed. It closed when it froze up. I mean, by late November, December, the canal was frozen, and it was always a big game to make sure you don't get frozen in, because if you get frozen in, somebody's going to steal your coal over the winter. Get through the system. You only got paid for a complete trip through the canal. And so the canal was closed, drained and closed at the approach of winter, and then getting it filled up again in the spring was a big problem.
And how would they fill it up? That's a lot of water.
A lot of water. They had feeder ponds and feeder lakes and rivers and stuff, all where these bodies of water would flow into the canal to fill up the canal. And there are places in the area of near Honesdale, for example, today where there are lakes and ponds that are 20 miles away from the canal. But they essentially they established these water courses from let's say, for example, one is called Oak Pond, where it just followed whatever path it had to get to the canal. Then they filled up the canal with that water, miles and miles away. And
did the canal ever leak?
That was a big problem when they opened the canal in '28. They had problems with leakage on the canal from '28 until the late '30s, because you just sort of pile all this, you dig this 4 foot deep,
just plain dirt.
Dirt, yeah, and the water is going to wash out. They had problems with muskrats and all kinds of animals burrowing in the sides of the canal, getting it to hold water. So literally, for over 10 years, they battled with the problem of making the walls rigid. And by 1839, they had it pretty well under control. So they started to become very profitable in 1839, because they managed to get their canal walls solid again, and they kept the same way that they kept revising the railroad. They revised the canal. It started out being 36 feet wide at water line, and then 20 feet at the base of the thing, and they modified the depth of the canal repeatedly in the 19th century. First of it was 4 feet deep, which could take 30 tons of coal in a boat. Then they made it 5 feet, then 5.5, then 6, then 6.5 feet deep. And so by the end of the 19th century, they were able to transport 130-ton boats. The boats were holding 130 tons of. Each boat was holding 130 tons of coal.
Now, this CD book is published by the Carbondale Historical Society and Museum. If somebody goes there, what do they see?
We have a very nice relationship with the city of Carbondale. We established on the 3rd floor of our very beautiful City Hall, which is a National Register building, a very lovely late 19th century Richardsonian Romanesque building. And we have a wonderful relationship with the city, and we've converted the whole 3rd floor into a D&H transportation museum. We have 2 rooms packed with D&H stuff of all kinds, and then we have a couple other galleries which are filled with sort of more or less conventional 19th century, early 20th century Americana type things, all with a direct Carbondale connection. So we're in a very nice relationship with the city of Carbondale, because they did not need the 3rd floor, and we got permission to use it. And then over the years, have gotten a number of grants and funding I think we're quite proud of that, of the 3rd floor. It's a beautiful asset for the city of Carbondale, because not that many small towns like Carbondale have a full-fledged museum. We're open 25 or so hours every week, so it's one can easily and clearly have a museum type experience.
And you are S. Robert Powell, PhD. What kind of PhD are you? I'm
a PhD in French language and literature from Indiana University in 1974, which is a long time ago. But most of my professional life has been as a teacher. I taught in the State University of New York and the City University of New York and Susquehanna University and Penn State and other places. I guess that's maybe at the end Penn State. But that background, I think, really prepared me in a way for this D&H stuff, because my doctoral dissertation is long. I'm an old windbag from start to finish. So I like big works and volume and stuff. So that but that academic perspective on it is sort of like divide and conquer. Take this one configuration at a time and get it sorted out. Get the details in order here, and not and don't just summarily breeze over, because that was a big problem, I think, with much of the writing on the D&H over the years, and there hasn't been a great deal, but one of the problems is that people sort of lump it all together, and they're not sure whether they're talking about what was going on in 29 or 45, and it makes a big difference. So 10 or 15 years ago, I decided I was going to approach this sort of step by step, inch by inch, and work my way through the century. And that's where I am now. These first 5, I feel very good about having liberated them from within this brain to.
But there's still 19 more volumes that you plan.
Yes, and the remarkable thing is that I get so energized by the whole notion of publishing and writing. When this happened on October 9, I announced at that point that 5 more of them are going to be published this October of 2015. But I got so energized by the process that I've now finished 4 of those, which are about ready to will come out in October. So I think this May, the 24 volumes may happen more quickly than I had originally planned, which is fine with me. But it's sort of like a log jam breaking. The first 5 were, I think, are crucial to everything that follows, and then. I'm working on one now, for example, on working horses and mules. I only focus on working horses and mules on the railroad and the canal, so I can really approach it in the greatest detail. And the thing which is quite extraordinary with our Carbondale collection is we have, I think, probably the best newspaper archive in northeastern Pennsylvania. We have newspapers in Carbondale from the 1820s on, and we have them all. And they've all been microfilmed. And I think I may be the only person ever to have read all of those newspapers, but I've been doing that for the last 15 years. And journalism in the 19th century was of the highest level in many places, and Carbondale is an extraordinarily good example of that. They're wonderful, wonderful, wonderful newspapers with amazing articles about life, about the railroad, about the community, and so reading those has essentially made it possible for me to sort of sketch out these 24 volumes. That's what I want to talk about. For example, there's one volume in the ones I'm working on now on water power. And not that I'm sitting here to blow my own horn, but nobody but me knows that there were water wheels on some of these planes. I'm the only person who knows that, and I know that only because of these newspapers.
Water wheels that did what?
That provided the power. Instead of these stationary steam engines, water wheels were at the heads of some of these planes, and the water wheels were on 5 planes between Honesdale and Carbondale at one point, which is just, people look at me like, say, Robert, you're crazy. What do you mean? I'll prove it to you. Let me show you. And then I back the process up, but that's an amazingly interesting process too. I guess the term is called cultural amnesia, but people in Carbondale who are surrounded by the remnants of this railroad sort of say to me the most amazing things. They say, you know what that is, and I say, I play down, I listen. They tell me these things. It is so wrong and so off the wall, but people sort of begin to invent their own sort of facts about what they think something is. And
what is still there that you can go and take a look at?
There are many of the sites where the stationary engines at the top of these planes are still. You can still visit the site. The engine has been gone, but has been taken. But you can see. You especially like in the wintertime, you can sort of look at the mountainside and you can sort of see like a path through the woods. That's plane number 5. You can sort of see where these planes were.
Are there markings there, or how do you figure out when you're there what you're looking at?
Well, it's difficult, and we are blessed to have some remarkable maps knowing pretty much where they were. So if you go to the site, you can sort of think, well, I'm at the head of plane number 5, then therefore a plane must have gone down that way. And then where did they go from here? You look around and you think, oh my God, they went right up there. You can sort of see a path through the woods where they went. So it requires a lot of sort of on-site exploring. You really have to be on site to get a sense of what happened there. And most of the terrain where this railroad was established is now privately held, so there are a lot of private property problems of trying to. You just can't go walking on other people's property. So there's a lot of but you can from for example Route 6. I can show you that's where level. You follow my. You can I can show you where something was. I may not be able to walk to it, but I know where it was, you know. And
is there evidence of the canal?
A lot of evidence of the canal. All the historical societies and many communities between Carbondale and the Hudson River are part of this thing which is called the Delaware and Hudson Transportation Heritage Council. So we're like an alliance of all these organizations who are interested in the canal, and we meet 4 times a year at various sites, several times along the canal. There's a meeting going on today as we speak in Huguenot, New York, at a canal site where the canal went through. And there are sections of the canal where there's still water in them, and you can walk along the towpath, and you can really get a sense of what took place there. And in many cases, the canal has been obliterated by the 20th century, but there are spots where one can go and get a sense of this is how the canal got from A to B. You know.
What became of the Delaware and Hudson Company?
The Delaware and Hudson Company went through lots of sort of changes in the 20th century where it was bought by other companies, and it's largely now non-existent. It's now been sort of a part of large conglomerates, and now it no longer exists as with engines, but and rolling stock. But interestingly enough, many of the diesel engines which were made in the 20th century used on the D&H by the American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York. They call these engines Alcos. Those engines are such fabulous machines, they're being recycled now and being used on other railroads. There's a railroad through Carbondale now called the Delaware-Lackawanna, where actually you see D&H engines coming into Carbondale as part of another system. The engines are recycled all the time on railroads. So here's a very good engine which has been now made a part of the rolling stock of as I say, like for the Delaware-Lackawanna. And one of my colleagues in the organization, his name is Corey Conway, is very focused on these Alco engines. And he and I have produced this a DVD, a conventional DVD on, and it's called Alco Thunder Returns to Carbondale, which is these recycled engines from earlier, from the 20th century, now in operation again. So there are bits and pieces of the D&H which sort of come into the modern world, but for the most part, it's gone, regrettably. But
and again, with the Carbondale Historical Society, if someone wants to know more about it, what do they do?
Well, we're like everybody else, we have a web page, carbondalehistorical.org, and so that we're very reachable that way, and we have all the usual telephones and all that sort of stuff. But through the web page we are very contactable, and it's and as I say, we're open 25 or so hours every week, which is I think pretty good for a small organization. There's only about 100 of us in the organization, and but we have a strong commitment to Carbondale and Carbondale history, and just about every day somebody comes up the stairs to the 3rd floor, and we're very happy to show them around. We're not crowded to the point where we have to have crowd control, but we have visitors, which is good.
We are out of time. We've been speaking with S. Robert Powell. He is the author of this series of books on CD, Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, Gravity Railroad. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.